So, welcome to today's Tech Leadership Lab. I'm really delighted to have joining us Stephane Kasriel, who is the head of product and a whole bunch of different acronyms that I don't fully understand that describe all the different facets of product for Meta's FAIR, which is fundamental AI research. It's been a real challenge to plan the content of the talk with Stefan because there are so many different things that we can talk about that relate to your career. I mean, you took Upwork public, where you've sort of been the leader of a late stage tech company that went public, faced the public markets. You were a member of the PayPal mafia early on and saw that company grow. But first off, it's a real pleasure to have you here. I think we met in 2015, World Economic
In
Forum.
China,
Yes,
out of
in
all places,
China. Yes. It was like during the peak of the sharing economy, gig economy craze. I really enjoyed our conversations over the years. I mean, you really have an amazing way of thinking about the world and the future of tech. I always learn something from our conversations. So welcome. It's sort of been a journey that's brought you here, right? What was the career journey that led to this point where you're sort of heading up this sort of really exciting initiative for Meta?
I'm old, so I've been doing this for a very long time. I did undergrad in France, where I'm from originally. I went to grad school in computer science at Stanford back in 1997 to 1999. Started a company, sold it, realized I made every single mistake you could come up with in 6 years, and that maybe I should get a business degree. So went to INSEAD for a year. Sorry, didn't go to NYU, my bad. So did that, and then frankly, a little bit by coincidence. So INSEAD is in France, at Fontainebleau, and PayPal was going to launch in Europe, and they called me. They're like, "Hey, you're like a French dude who comes from tech, comes from Silicon Valley. Like, help us launch this thing." And I was like, "Hey, I have nothing else to do anyway. It's not like I have plans for the future. So this sounds pretty cool. Let's go do that and see if it works." And that was pretty big success. We ended up launching PayPal in a bunch of countries in Europe, and it ended up being pretty successful. And then moved back to the US, still with PayPal for another couple of years. But by then it had become kind of like slow and bureaucratic and less fun. And so I started working on PayPal's consumer strategy, which was essentially how do you get people to click on the button? Like every merchant was accepting the PayPal button, but no consumer was clicking on it. Which at some point, if you think about the math, you don't want to be the payment system that's accepted everywhere but used by no one. So we were trying to find what are the ways to get consumers to actually click on the button. And one of the running hypothesis at the time was habituation, which has become kind of a negative word, but at the time was a pretty positive idea. Was nobody remembered their password. Nobody even knew what that PayPal button was because nobody was going through the experience. So we were looking for these high frequency use cases that would get a potentially small number of people to be really engaged. What is now called growth marketing or growth hacking or what have you. And one of those use cases was digital commerce, so small low value purchases in games. And that got me introduced to a bunch of companies that did this stuff, and I ended up just falling in love with this company called Zong, which was a mobile payments company. And so I left PayPal to go join Zong, which we then sold to PayPal 2 years later. So that was kind of weird.
That's a good career move.
Yeah, that was kind of I mean, financially it was good, but it was kind of super weird. It's kind of like you leave in the middle of the movie and you come back and you're watching the end of the movie and people are like, "I remember you," and you're like, "Yeah, I've been gone for 2 years, but nobody noticed." Yeah. So then I had a non-compete where I couldn't do payments for a number of years. So I ended up leaving PayPal to work at the company that I was at when we met, which at the time was called Odesk, which was a big customer of PayPal, but was not in the non-compete. So I was actually allowed to go there. Initially, I joined to lead the product management team, and then the VP of engineering decided to retire, so I led product and engineering for a while. Then we merged with our main competitor, which was a company called Elance, and the two CEOs left, one at the time of the merger, one a few months later. So I became the CEO of the combined company. And then 2 years after that, we took it public. Then I ran it as a public company CEO for 2 years. And then I was like, "Hey, got the message. This is not fun at all. I need to go do something else." And
what are some of the challenges there?
It's just a very different type of skill set. I mean, I've learned a lot. I think if I did it again, I would do it differently. I can totally see how this could be a lot more fun than I made it be, but I made quite a few mistakes during those 2 years. I would say the biggest one was, so it's a marketplace, and I felt like now I'm running two marketplaces. One, which is, our customers buying from each other, and the second one is the stock market. Like getting more shareholders to buy my stock is going to increase the stock price. Turns out it's not very effective. First of all, it's super regulated. There's this thing called Reg F, Reg E, Reg something. Can't even remember what it's called, but it's basically like saying everybody should have access to the same information, which means you can spend as much time with investors as you want. You can't tell them anything that you haven't told everybody else, which means you spend, dozens of hours, hundreds of hours a year just repeating yourself and saying nothing interesting. Like the best case scenario is you said nothing useful. Worst case scenario is you said something useful, which then needs to be disclosed urgently to the SEC because you weren't supposed to disclose anything useful. So in hindsight, I probably should have spent less time with public investors and more time just continuing to do what we were doing prior to the IPO, just running the company. But anyway, as during that time, Facebook at the time was launching this cryptocurrency product called Libra, and the guy who was leading the Libra initiative was the founder of Zong, the company I had worked at 10 years before. And Libra was from day one, I think Facebook was very clear that they couldn't be owning Libra. It needed to be a decentralized, blockchain system. So it needed to have many different members. And, it was always going to be a risky project. So he was trying to enlist friends who were in positions to be making decisions. If you look at the initial Libra association, it was basically Friends of David. And I happened to be one of them. So as part of going public with Upwork, we were trying to pitch investors not just on Upwork as a company, but also Upwork as a founding member to the Libra Association. And that didn't really resonate with Wall Street, so we abandoned it. But I personally kept on being super interested in it. So when it was time to leave Upwork, that's what I did. I joined Meta to go work on Libra. Of course, that ended up, for people who followed the history there, ended up being super politically controversial and really painful, up to the point where eventually Mark Zuckerberg, our Mark, decided, hey, enough pain. He had to testify in front of Congress twice. It was just like, it was not a super profitable idea for Meta to begin with. It was more like, hey, we could do something good for the world. And at some point, there was just so much resistance to it that we just, stopped working on it. And so I did a few more things within Meta at that point, but ultimately ended up in Fair, where I've been now for about a year.
Okay.
So that's 30 years in 5 minutes.
Okay, well, sounds sort of fascinating. Seems like there've been so many different facets to your experience. I think it's always, I feel like there's a unique learning that you go through when you're sort of scaling a marketplace company. People look at it from the outside and they say, oh, they see the successful ones. They don't see all the graveyard full of failed marketplace companies and just how difficult it is to sort of get that supply-demand flywheel going.
Yeah. And it doesn't even get easier. I think there's a myth of, you get to what people call PMF, product market fit. It's like really hard until then, but then it gets really easy. In that particular vertical, so Upwork is a marketplace for work. So they connect, businesses with freelancers.
Yeah.
And you would say, okay, well, you get to some kind of escape velocity and then it's all, amazing from there. And the reality is there's only 2 companies that ever, really got to that level of scale and went public, Fiverr and Upwork. And below that, there's another 10 to 25 that got to the $100 million mark, let's say, which is still super impressive. Getting buyers and sellers to want to transact $100 million a year on your platform is not easy at all. And then there were hundreds that ended up in the 10 million range. So it's not like, you get the recipe and then it works forever. It's like you get the recipe for the next phase and then it breaks, and then you need to figure out the recipe for the next phase and it breaks. And you have limited time to find the next solution before, especially if you're not profitable, you're literally going to run out of money.
Yeah.
And if you happen to be at a time when investors are flush with money and willing to take another bet on you, you might be able to get a bridge or, some kind of down round. But chances are, if you don't get to the next level in time and continue to meet the expectations of investors, you're just not going to get there. And I think that's true for every business. It's not like any business is ever an easy ride, but I would say marketplace businesses in particular, the recipe to go from 0 to 1 million are completely different from the ones to go from 1 to 10 and et cetera.
10 to 100, yeah. And the network effects that everybody thinks will keep you going can also amplify the speed with which sort of the spiral unfolds, right? Because
completely.
Everybody's there for critical mass. But let's sort of unpack fundamental AI research or FAIR for a little, for the audience, because a lot of us who are in research know the visible product Llama, right? And those of us who do Gen AI research have all used Llama. It's open source. Thank you very much for that. I think a lot of people's conception is that this is what fundamental AI research is at Meta. It's their open source large language model, but my understanding is that it's much more than that, right? So, can you give us a sense for the scope and ambition of FAIR?
Yeah, I mean, I think like if you had to just give it in one sentence, it's the moonshot factory for AI at Meta, right? So like it doesn't really do Llama. Like Llama is not part of FAIR anymore. It's a separate group. So FAIR's been around for 12 years at this point. By the way, Yann Lequin, who's here, like at NYU, founded FAIR, 12 years ago. And he's still, involved quite heavily. And the idea is to really come up with really big disruptive things, not like, not just a series of incremental steps, but things that are transformational for the industry. Potentially like one of their earliest breakthroughs was building something called PyTorch, which is the, Python framework that's now, like the number one framework for building AI models. Was basically one of those things where you scratch your own itch. The FAIR researchers were struggling with just rebuilding the same stuff over and over again on C++ or on Python. And eventually they started building libraries for themselves. And then they realized, hey, this might be useful for the rest of Meta. So they made it available. And then, because we open source a lot of stuff, we open source it and it just, grew like wildfire. But eventually it becomes like very operational. And it first moved from FAIR to another group within Meta and then graduated outside of Meta, where it's now, I think it's the Linux or Apache Foundation that manages PyTorch. So anybody can contribute to it. Meta employees, including FAIR, continue to contribute to it, but it's an open source project managed by the community. Llama was the same thing. Like the first version of Llama, maybe Llama 1 for sure, and I think Llama 2 were built entirely by, within the FAIR research group. But eventually we said, hey, this is becoming like a really big thing, and we don't want to just work on that. So we spun it out as a separate group within Meta. Some of the FAIR people went there and are still there. Some of them went there and came back. And then they hired their own researchers and engineers to work on it. And so we continue to work on a bunch of different things, some of which are like super like theoretical. We have people that work on CERN, accelerator, like particle acceleration. We have people that do theorem proving in math. They literally take some of the existing problems that are unsolved research and work with AI researchers to try to find computational solutions to these problems. And we have things that are more applied. We work in robotics. So we, like Meta just hired a new VP who is leading the product group for robotics. So the goal is to eventually, have household robots that you can that can do your chores so that you don't have to do them. But behind the product, there's a huge amount of AI research. Like the robotics at this stage, despite all the crazy videos where you might think that these are solved problems, it's totally not a solved problem. Like if you put a robot, one of the tests for us is we rent an Airbnb and we put the robot there and we say, do the dishes, and they cannot do the dishes. And I don't think that's us because we suck. I don't think that anybody else's robots can do that either. They tend to be...
it's one of those robotics paradoxes, right? That they can do like incredibly complex things.
Well, it's called Moravec paradox, which is like AIs tend to be amazing at things that we are not very good at as humans, which we find incredible. And they tend to like be really pathetically bad at things that we take for granted because we could do them when we were, I don't know when you started doing dishes for your parents, but like, below 10 years old, you can definitely do that if you're being asked to do it. And robots still can't do it today. And that's not despite, like lots of people trying. So we have like a broad, spectrum. We have people doing chemistry and applied materials, which is useful for us internally. You were asking me like, what's the most exciting product right now? Like we do a lot of work on augmented reality. One of the big challenges for augmented reality right now is to build a physical lens, like glass, something like glass that is both highly transparent so that you can see the real world, but also highly refractive so that we can project a hologram on it. And those materials don't exist. Like there's no place on Earth where you can find them.
Okay.
The closest thing to this right now is a crystal that you can synthesize, but the industrial manufacturing product is so lossy, like you have to basically like discard 99% of the ones that you produce. And so as a result, the Orion demos that we gave last year, those lenses are the 0.1% that survived the process, and that's why they cost north of $10,000 to manufacture, and that's why we're not commercializing them. So finding through AI, new molecules that don't exist in nature that would have the types of chemical and optical properties is one of the things that we work on. But by extension, you build those generic models that can also be used to try to, discover new catalysts for green hydrogen or new ways of doing carbon capture or just about any type of material. So we open source, on the order of 10,000 molecules or more every year, which, where we describe predicted properties of them. And the science behind this is known. It's quantum mechanics. People have known how this works for 100 years. The complexity of the computation, if you have more than like a few electrons, like bumping into each other, is computationally completely crazy. So the traditional software to do this is both super slow and relatively imprecise because it's relying on like simplifying hypotheses that don't actually work in practice.
Okay.
The AI models, and Meta is not the only one. Like Microsoft has some great research there. Google has some great research, but we're like pretty leading there. And the types of AI models that we run are both more precise than the traditional software, but also on a per flop basis, or like per unit of computation, they're 100,000 times faster. And there's not that many places in the world, like typically in industry, if you do something like 50% faster, you feel like a genius. If you're like 100% faster, you feel like you're like, this is like 100,000 times faster. So something that used to take a day basically takes less than a second. And so you can get to the point where the machines start to generate their own hypothesis of which molecules might work. So you basically ask them for a problem to solve, find me a molecule that might be able to, cure this disease or, have these types of chemical properties. And you let it think for like a week or a month, and it comes back with a few dozen or a few hundred potential solutions. And then you work with, an actual lab that produces them in practice to see which ones might work.
Okay.
So it's a pretty broad range, and the idea is to like graduate some of these things into like real products, both for Meta and for the industry overall.
Okay. And what sort of is there sort of a guiding principle or theme that sets the scope?
Yeah, it starts with AI, right? So like all of the researchers, there's about 1,000 people at FAIR. All of them are, it goes from like pure math to applied math to pure CS, but everybody's working on building AI models. So it's anything that involves like coming up with, a new research hypothesis that is not just, a 2% improvement on somebody else's research, but it's something that is, massive and disruptive. And, essentially coming up, like you're getting grants within Meta, like you would be getting grants within a university. You're making a case for why you think you can do this uniquely better than anybody else and why it should matter to the world. Okay. And then, we fund it with dollars to potentially, buy data sets or what have you, GPU budget. So we give you a number of, big machines to run with, potentially like some help. So you might get some engineers to work with you, some, PhD interns to work with you or what have you. You build a team around you. And then, you come up with milestones of what you're going to deliver in 6 months. And then we'll give you more money if you, deliver there and keep, growing it until the point where it's either like done and you just move on to something else, or it failed and we learn something and we move to something else.
Beyond it being AI, there's no, FAIR hasn't put any strict boundaries around this is the kind of work we're not going to do.
Yeah, no, so generally we all, like all the big labs are pursuing AGI, right? We call it AMI. Jan loves to call it AMI. People have long debates about it, maybe because it's French and AMI means friend in French. But AMI means like something like advanced machine intelligence as opposed to like AGI, which is artificial general intelligence. But the point is, you want to, if you said what are humans good at, and you could come up with, hundreds of different tasks that humans are good at, and you want to get to the place where AIs are, as good or ideally better than humans at as many of them as possible, and ideally in a like set of building blocks that can be reassembled in any way you want, right? So like if you think about what does a robot need to have, it needs to be able to do navigation, it needs to be able to do manipulation, dexterity, like use your fingers, don't crush the egg, but don't drop it either. Reasoning, speech recognition, you need to be able to talk to the robot, vision. So it's a bunch of different models, a bunch of different building blocks that you assemble. Whereas, if you want to do a wearable, agent and you want to be able to talk to your glasses, it's a completely, obviously your glasses are not going to walk and they're not going to do like a bunch of different things, but they'll require things like memory of remembering, like what did I discuss with Arun last time I saw him and what did we talk about and that type of stuff. So there's different pieces to it, but generally the idea is work towards this idea of artificial general intelligence.
Okay. So how do you when you describe sort of the scope of your role to me, it sounds incredibly challenging, right? Because like the way you describe FAIR sounds like a well-funded university that is not dependent on federal grants.
Too soon.
And yeah, too soon, yeah. But there are scientists, and you've got like some of the world's best scientists, and they sort of march to the beat of their own drum. There's computational costs can sort of run into the billions. And people sort of tend to follow the path that they think is going to lead something, and then you're trying to harness this into products.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the pace of AI progress, and I know people like to sort of say it's faster than anything before it, but it really is, right? I mean, there's the speed with which, even in the language domain, the new models are coming out is not something that I've seen in any other domain. So that by itself seems like a challenge for people who are building products around AI. But you have on top of that trying to orient what is essentially a research lab into products. Give us a sense for how you approaching this as a manager. You've been a successful product guy for a long time, right?
There's a Venn diagram between what Meta wishes FAIR would work on and what FAIR wishes that Meta would fund it to do. And the easy part is the stuff that's at the intersection of the Venn diagram. There's a bunch of things that are either have come out in the last few weeks or will come out pretty soon that are like very clearly aligned between what FAIR researchers found to be really exciting and what makes a ton of sense in Meta's models. That's, I would say,
I've had images of Meta rushing to sort of make SEC disclosures after this.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, my bad. There's a bunch of obvious ones, like we have image generation models, we have like image understanding models, we have like all sorts of things like this, which are like, if you're an Instagram creator, is pretty awesome, right? Yeah. So those are like, I would say, strategically the easy ones, and it's all about execution. But execution really matters because, to your point, like speed is super essential. Like the model that is state of the art right now that can be super impressive in your product, if you wait 6 months to take it to market, including because we open source all this stuff. So if we take 6 months to take it to market, but our competitors use it and launch the product immediately, we don't feel good about ourselves, right? So there is clearly like a pipeline type of management situation here where there's a lot of research risk in this product. So if you tell the Instagram group, like, hey, we're going to have this amazing model in 6 months, get ready for it, and then it fails, they get angry at you. But if you call them the day before saying, hey, we're going to have this amazing model tomorrow, you'd better ship it, they're also angry at you because, like it's too late, right? And so finding ways to, de-risk the research and progressively, get the transition, the transfer of information from the research team all the way to the product group. But that, I would say, is kind of like, how do you operationalize this in a replicable way and build a muscle of being able to launch more and more AI-generated products, whether it's recommendation systems, integrity systems, generative models, and what have you. The part that's always a little bit tougher is to like increase the size of the Venn diagram, and there's a pull and push, right? And on one side, the DNA of FAIR was really like hire the best researchers in their domain, have them come up with their own projects. And then if it's useful to Meta, great. If it's not, that's okay. Like it's perfectly acceptable.
It's sort of like a Bell Labs kind of strategy.
Jan worked at Bell Labs for a number of years, right? And Bell Labs, invented the laser, the transistor, like satellites, just about everything. So the model is still there and it's still like very real. At the same time, the speed at which and the level of investment of AI today means that it's not insignificant on Meta's P&L, and the level of expectations from investors is definitely different now than it was 5 years ago. And so like just saying, hey, we have a lab and sometimes they'll generate stuff and it's going to be cool. I think increasingly there's a huge amount of pressure to say, okay, but like, how do you actually make like some real, like, how do you justify the tens of billions of dollars of investment in this stuff? Show us the business case for this. Now, I would say in Meta's case, historically, both in ranking and in ads, those AI investments, like every time we've scaled the models that run the feed algorithm for Facebook and Instagram, or the ranking algorithms for ads, they've been incredibly ROI positive. So like historically, I think we've been able to demonstrate this, but Wall Street does not really care about historically. They care about what you're going to do the next 6 months or the next 2 years or what have you. And so there is definitely intense pressure to say, hey, okay, you're investing massively in this whole AI strategy for Meta. What is your strategy to make it be valuable to investors? So there's definitely like both how do you execute on the current overlap, but also how do you progressively find a path that both delivers this idea of build AGI for the world, but also benefits the business of Meta.
So what do you do to to increase that overlap in the Venn diagram? I mean, like, sort of tactically, are there, can you talk about any of the...
So VPs at Meta have the privilege of being able to name their conference room. So my conference room is called Connect the Dots.
Okay.
And that's what I do. It's basically like have a pretty good understanding of what the other groups within Meta do and what they need, pretty good understanding of what the research teams within FAIR are doing, and trying to make sure that, we get the right teams to talk to each other who otherwise might not know. We have a team within FAIR that focuses on language translation.
Yeah.
From a scientific standpoint, like the most interesting stuff is the long tail languages. There's something like 7,000 spoken languages in the world. Improving translation for English to French, useful, but like marginally interesting scientifically. Conversely, doing like super, like long tail languages, very interesting scientifically, somewhat questionable from a business standpoint. And so it's, there's almost like this distribution curve of the two, distributions, what the business wants from FAIR and what FAIR wants from the business. You're trying to like, increase the standard deviation of both and try to like, put the means closer to each other and get people excited about working together.
Okay. And what's sort of the time scale over which you, when you're thinking about, so there's so many billions of dollars of investment going into FAIR, is there a structured way in which people think about this is the horizon over which we're expecting ROI?
Yeah.
Or is it sort of like, let's just keep putting the money in and it'll pay for itself at some point?
I would say there's the theory and the practice, right? I mean, the theory is just pure portfolio management or pipeline management. Or, like if you were like a pharmaceutical company, you'd be thinking about it the same way. And at an aggregate level, that kind of works. Like if the law of big numbers does work, if you have, hundreds of different researchers and, billions of dollars of investments, you do end up having some quick wins and some like longer term bets. And some of them, do better than you thought they would. And some of them do worse than you thought they would. And you've got, 12 plus years of history of doing this. So you've kind of calibrated how well you're going to do. And then there's the practice of like, if you're asking me like in 12 months, concretely, what is going to work? I don't know.
Okay.
Because there is still a huge amount of scientific risk. And that's frankly what FAIR is expected to do. It's supposed to be taking doing non-obvious bets that are not going to get solved otherwise and not going to get solved. There's plenty of other AI groups within Meta.
Yeah.
And they're, tasked with being closer to products and lower risk type of stuff. And they have more visibility into what's going to work or not in 12 months. With FAIR, like on average, we know roughly like a few things are going to work in the next 12 months. But which one specifically, it's really hard to tell.
Okay. And sort of more broadly, compared to 5 years ago, many more Stern students and alumni are, connected to tech product management in some form. And I've encountered a lot of product managers and sort of product leaders over the last year who have talked about how the fact that when the product is built around AI, and especially when it sort of has a generative AI component to it, that there are these new and unique challenges that come up. I mean, cost structure is one that sort of often comes up, but looking at the products that come out of FAIR and embedding them into Meta's products and comparing that to sort of products that you've led in the past, I mean, what would you say are the key differences?
Well, so first of all, there's just way less history of, like we don't know as much about these systems or what makes them work or what a good PM for AI system does compared to like traditional software. Like if you wanted to do consumer product management at Facebook or enterprise software management at, Workday, there's a school for how to learn how to do this. And there's like, 2 decades worth of blogs that you can read and people you can talk to. Nobody has 2 decades worth of AI PM experience. It just doesn't exist, right? I think the emerging reality though is there's two layers. One is if you like the model as the product versus the product as the product, right? The model as the product, if you're a PM working on models, so you're a PM working on Llama as an example, a big chunk of your job is doing what the industry call evaluations. And essentially it's the replacement for the PRD, right? And the question is, what should the model be good at? Because by definition, the model can't be good at everything. It's going to be good at, whatever you train it to be. And so defining what the success criteria are going to be is going to be really important. Researchers call it hill climbing. So you define what the hill is. You say, here's how we're going to evaluate the model. And then they find ways of like getting as high as they can, as fast as they can on the hill. And usually it's a competition. Like there's a bunch of different, expeditions that are all trying to climb the same hill at the same time. And whoever plants the flag at the top feels like they're the winner, and whoever is number 2 feels bad, right? And so that, like AI product management is picking the hill and being very crisp about describing like, here's what really matters to the user at the end. But then increasingly it's user facing. Like historically, a lot of this stuff was academic, right? So like there were no users for these AI models. So a lot of the evaluations would be based on what researchers thought would be like aligned with what humans want. But increasingly there's like, like if you're ChatGPT or if you're, Meta AI, you have hundreds of millions of users, and you can look at what they're looking for, and you can look at where they were happy with the answer or not happy with the answer. So increasingly, the role of the PM is to kind of, segment the user base, like the types of things that you would do. And so this is like the model as the product, where you're really saying, how do we product manage this model as if it was a user-facing product? But then there's the product on top of the model, which tends to be a lot more like traditional software, where you kind of take the AI as a black box, but not quite, because you kind of need to understand like what its strengths and weaknesses are, and then you build compelling products on top of it. And like Notebook LM would be a perfect example of this. Like Notebook LM is not a model; it's using Gemini, but it was a super clever use of Gemini that like went completely viral because nobody expected to have a model that could generate a interesting podcast where two different speakers interrupt each other and have like a super. I mean, just like we're having a conversation, like you're suddenly hearing somebody, like two speakers, talk about the document you just wrote, and it's like surreal the first time you have it. And that is like an example of you take the product, the model as a component of your solution, but you're building a product on top of it.
Is the level of unpredictability that's inherent in Gen AI and coupled with the speed at which the models are evolving, are these sort of meaningful aspects to how you think about building products on top of them, or are they sort of second order effects and you just sort of build a product the way that you normally would?
I mean, I think it depends on the product you're trying to build. There's plenty of products where creativity is actually a good thing. Like you want the models to hallucinate. In fact, most models have a parameter called the temperature. You can increase the temperature to make them, hallucinate more, because that's what you want. If you're trying to do creative writing as a product, as an example, you want it to follow your guidelines, but in a way, like if you're prompting it 10 times the same way, you kind of want 10 different stories to come out, because that's exactly what you're paying the model to do. Conversely, if you're trying to do like customer support in a way that represents your brand and you're a regulated financial services company, like you probably don't want the model to hallucinate at all. And you might instead put a lot of controls in place to make sure that, the output of the model is aligned with your regulated requirements, might be aligned with your brand strategy, with your and potentially in some cases it's a co-pilot type of strategy where the model is not responding to the user, the model is preparing a templated answer that a human agent will use to confirm or change, and it's meant as a productivity enhancer for your existing sales team or your existing customer support team, as opposed to a full automation of the system.
Okay. We've all been able to benefit from Llama because Llama is open source. And we use small Llama more than big Llama.
Yeah, H100s are expensive.
Yes. And there's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of years about Meta's choice to make Llama open source. On the positive side, clearly this has been a huge boon for researchers and for people, I'm sure, in other countries to be able to sort of have access to a cutting edge language model, because they would not be able to afford to pay for access to GPT or Gemini or Claude, or like Anthropic's models. On the flip side, first, there's a competitive dimension to it, right? Your value capture is more limited as compared to OpenAI or Google, who are sort of value capturing presumably from their cutting edge models. But there's also other risks that people have highlighted from open source AI that is this powerful. The inherent power of this AI in the hands of the wrong person. And if it's open source, it's in the hands of anyone. There's the national security and inter-country competition dimension that has come up of where leveling the playing field is good, but leveling the playing field, is that the best strategy for the US? And so, I mean, what are your thoughts here? Because clearly there's no one right answer, but it feels like Meta has departed. I realize that there are roots in, PyTorch, and, there's plenty of stuff that Google has open sourced as well, starting from Hadoop. When Meta was Facebook, they put Hive out there and this changed distributed databases. But this is sort of a different product, right? What do you think leads to the confidence that Meta has that open source is the right strategy? And how do you sort of balance the risks, the clear risks that could be associated with open source AI?
Almost every decision in life, there's a benefit and a downside to it.
Yeah.
And I think the overall decision is on balance. The benefits outweighs the risk. I think the national security angle has been answered already. Like there's at least 2, if not 3, like really powerful Chinese models these days that are open source. So as a US company, we can choose not to and let Chinese companies be the only ones dominating open source
there
software.
is a theory that they built them on Llama to begin with, but I don't know if that's true or not.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what's true or not? But one technique that people use is called distillation.
That's a really profound statement, right?
No, but it's hard to know exactly. There's what people say they do, and then there's the reality. So unless you're in those labs, you don't really know what they did. But there is a technique called distillation, which has a completely acceptable way of being. So distillation is a big model teaches a small model. We use it for ourselves. We disclosed it when we launched Llama 4, 2 versions of Llama 4 a couple of weeks ago. And they're both distilled, so it's called Scout and Maverick. And they're smaller models that are distilled from a bigger model that we haven't yet open source called Behemoth, which is still training. So the big model is really expensive to run. To your point, you wouldn't run this on your laptop as an example. But it's super powerful at teaching the smaller models to learn better than they would learn on their own. And that is completely legitimate. There's no legal or ethical questions about it. What becomes more problematic is when a company is distilling models from another company. And so some of the rumors have been that some of those models have been trained and distilled from US-based companies' models, in many cases against the terms of service of those companies, right? So we all have terms of service. They're more or less permissive, and they state what you can or can't do. And in many cases, they state you can't train competing models using the output of the models. And it's questionable whether that was the case or not. But whatever they ended up doing, those models are out there, open source, in real life, highly competitive. And that whole space is super dynamic, super competitive. Every week, there's new models coming out. And I would say generally, the press gets excited every week because I think people are not understanding there's a curve. Right? There's a Moore's law for AI, many Moore's laws for AI. The cost per token, if you take a GPT 3.5 level quality performance, by most measures, the cost has been divided by somewhere between 100 and 1,000 over the last 18 months. Yeah. Right? So this is Moore's law, 2 orders of magnitude more. And so if you're launching your model 3 months after the previous one, it looks like complete genius compared to the previous one because in 3 months that curve is pretty steep. And that's why every week there's new press coming out. It's not to belittle the genius. I mean, it's not like those Moore's laws happen by themselves. They happen through huge amount of work by a lot of scientists. But generally everybody's kind of hill climbing the same stuff and everybody's on the same curve. And so every 3 months there's some new, crazily better model than the previous one. Some of them are open source, some of them are not. I think at this point, the jury is still out whether the open source models are ever going to be as powerful as the closed source models. But they're clearly sufficiently powerful to be broadly useful for a very large number of use cases. I think at this stage we announced that we've had 1 billion downloads for Llama models. So I'm not even sure there are 1 billion developers in the world. I guess not. So I'm not totally sure. I guess the same developers download it multiple times for whatever reason. But the point is, it's extremely broadly used both in research and academia, but also in industry, both small startups and the Fortune 500 in the US and globally. And to your point, there's a lot of countries that couldn't afford to do this research otherwise. And I think the idea of building these models in a way that is multilingual, is adaptable to multiple different norms and cultures, and is open source for the world is definitely a good thing for the world overall.
Okay.
And by the way, it's not really selfless from Meta. We benefit from it as well. Historically, PyTorch, that's what kids learn in university. So when they graduate, they can come to Meta where they're going to be using PyTorch, or they can go to the competitor where they're going to be using nobody's, system because nobody learns it anymore. So they come to Meta, right? I mean, there's a lot of really valuable side effects from open sourcing. You're basically shaping the discourse, you're creating the ecosystem around you, and some of it benefits you back in the form of, NVIDIA tests their chips using Llama. PhD students learn to use Llama more than other systems because it's open source, and so it's easier for them to come work at Meta. So there's plenty of like business reasons for doing it, but overall the idea is also like philosophically we've always done open science and always done open models and open source, and we're going to try to continue to do this while keeping safety in mind because it really matters a lot.
Okay, and perhaps the genie is out of the bottle at this point, and so
But I think like we keep making it. So to be clear, we do very rigorous security evaluations of our models, just like everybody else does. And I think we signed up. I can't remember exactly what the document ended up saying, but like we basically signed up for saying we will not open source a model if it doesn't pass. If we think it becomes like more of a security risk, then our threshold would be we would not open source the model.
Okay. Why don't we take 3 questions from the audience?
I've saw in some interviews that you have kids and you're a big family person. I was wondering, how are you telling your kids to embrace AI right now? And are you scared of, whether they lose the critical thinking skill? And the secondly is it harder being a father or a CEO?
Okay.
It's much harder to be a dad because your kids never do what you want them to do, and generally your employees do what you want them to do because otherwise they get fired. What's your other question? Sorry.
How do you tell your kids to embrace?
Oh yeah, I think so. This is like an age-old topic. I was reading this the other day. There's this story of Plato. Some Egyptian god is giving writing to the pharaoh and saying, hey, now that you have writing, you're going to be a lot smarter. Your memory is going to be increased because you can remember the entire world. And of course, the world at the time was using oral history, and suddenly everybody forgot everything. Nobody had memory anymore. You guys are probably, most of you, too young to remember, but we used to remember people's phone numbers because you had to. And now you don't because it's in your phone. I don't even know my kids' phone numbers because it's in my phone. So in a way, you got dumber. In another way, you probably freed up a bunch of brain space to be able to learn other things. And so what I tell my kids is use those things to learn. Don't use those things to do your homework. But first of all, it's bad from an integrity standpoint, but B, it makes you dumb. It doesn't make you smart. So find ways to, it's amazing. If you don't understand how to do your homework, one of the things that's messed up about education usually is you go to school and the teacher is broadcasting to you, and then you come home and you're stuck with a white sheet of paper trying to do your homework and nobody's there to help you. That's where those, AIs can really help you with. You take Meta AI in WhatsApp, you can take a picture of the homework. Don't ask for the answer. Ask it to help you think through the answer, and that's actually super valuable.
You've been a public company CEO, so you understand capital allocation. I can't think of very many prequels that think about mobile networks where you had 5 or 6 or globally maybe 8 companies chasing the same prize as you do now. Typically, the prize becomes a lot less rewarding as there's 5 or more or even 3 or more competitors. So how do you think about the return that Meta will get as it's trying to achieve AGI?
I think in success, we all have jobs at the end, and we all feel more fulfilled, and we all feel greater. We were just having this discussion, before coming here. If it makes all of us more productive, companies should want to hire more of us. Right? Essentially, if we were infinitely productive, we'd essentially be free. And if we were all free, we'd be hiring a lot more people because free people can deliver huge amounts of value. So if you think about the total addressable market of work today is about $10 trillion. If you could make everybody 10 times more productive, then the total addressable market is $100 trillion. That's plenty more space than 5 companies building, meaningful amount of market cap. That is kind of the underlying premise behind AGI. It's going to make us, either completely useless and we're all going to be miserable and lose all of our jobs, and that's the worst case scenario, or it's going to make us incredibly valuable to companies because we're so much more productive, and as a result, they'll be hiring a lot more people, and we'll all be more fulfilled working on more interesting work and what have you. The jury is still out. We'll see where this lands, but that's why everybody's pursuing AGI.
Yeah. The translating AI into products.
Oh yeah. So the tactical question here is it's pretty simple, right? So the way Meta is organized, it has research groups, and FAIR is one of them, and product groups, and there's a tech transfer process where research, when it matures, goes into the production environment where product groups take it into Meta's product. So if you take FAIR as an example, we graduated Llama into a product group. Llama became the user-facing version of Llama inside of Meta's app. It's called Meta AI, and you can use it inside of the Ray-Ban Meta glasses. You can use it inside of WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram. In some cases, it looks like a chat bot. You literally chat with it. In other cases, it's more like prompts that were generated by the machine itself. So the machine will say, hey, based on the content you're looking right now, you might be interested in, let me generate a picture of you like as an astronaut, or let me like think that you're interested in this question. Why don't you click here to like get that question answer for you? And it starts a chat thread about, what was Taylor Swift's, latest, whatever, something. So that's how it, shows up in the products.
From a regulatory perspective, do you see certain markets running away with sort of the lead on AGI and AI in general because their markets are freer than other markets? I know that Europe has a much different perspective on consumer data protection and how companies have to manage data within a nation and on the cloud and everything.
Yeah, I mean, like any company, we have to comply with local regulations, right? So like if you look at our products, we usually launch them in the US before we launch them in Europe. And I think we've been pretty public about the fact that we wish we could launch them faster in different countries in Europe. But when the regulation is unclear or potentially just prevents us from doing things, then we just are not able to launch the product.
But do you think that this is gonna, if China chooses a far less regulated approach, do you think that the national regulation is gonna be a driver of national advantage or disadvantage in the AI front, or maybe the other way around?
I think it really depends. Like if you think the AI is going to destroy the world, or if you think AI is going to, like improve the world. Like if you're very risk adverse and you think like there's a lot more downside than upside, then you end up regulating more, and then you're going to get what you want, which is less AI. The bet you're making is that the rest of the world will not, embrace AI in a way that actually makes this a self-fulfilling. I'm a European. Personally, like this is not Meta's point of view. This is Stephane's point of view. I feel really bad, and whenever I get a chance to talk to members of the French government, like I'm like, guys, what are you doing to yourselves? Like, your businesses are less competitive when you regulate more. Your consumers are less productive. They're less creative. They're less able to use those products. This is not good for you. I think the stance that people have in some of the European countries is like, if we don't know for sure that something's going to be good, then let's wait and see type of approach. And the problem when it's moving really fast is wait and see means you might just be losing the boat. And then I'm personally like, again, this is not Meta's point of view, this is mine, but I'm personally pretty concerned that Europe is spending too much time regulating tech and not enough time like thinking about how to leverage it, including US tech. It doesn't have to be European tech, but how do you make French companies more competitive by using ChatGPT and Claude and Meta AI and what have you, because it does give you a competitive advantage or a competitive disadvantage if you don't use it and global competitors are using it.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a few years ago. I had a meeting of tech regulation, a discussion about tech regulation, where one thread was people who were working on self-driving cars. I think this was like 2016, 2017, and another group who were working on gene drive research and non-human organisms. This was like a lot of excitement about CRISPR at the time, and they were trying to sort of edit the gene of the mosquito to, make it less able to carry pathogens in East Asia. And the culture of approach to regulation and risk was just so starkly contrasting with the and because both of these are potentially life-threatening technologies, right? But the autonomous vehicles was very much still in the beta testing sort of mindset of let's get some level of capability and roll it out there and sort of build a product with the customer the way we did with spreadsheets. And the gene drive research folks were, let's perfect this and then let's sit and wait for 5 years to think about whether something could go wrong. And it's a hard question, I think, because we're sort of in this uncharted, as you point out. I mean, we don't know if this is going to be massive good or this is going to sort of have in it. So we don't really have a good frame for thinking about, what is the right balance between, is the French approach the right approach? In the long run, will the United States be wiped out and the French will remain standing? And
I think there's also like an underlying
French.
But there's also like an underlying belief, which is like doing nothing is less risky than doing something. You think about could AI solve climate change as an example? Probably. Just having more brains, try to think about new ways of doing carbon capture, new ways of doing more efficient, engine designs or what have you, and AI can really accelerate this. Meanwhile, doing nothing might mean we actually have catastrophic climate change that was preventable. So I think that, some cases the risk of doing nothing is also like something that should not be undercounted, and that tends to be kind of the, at least my friends in France tend to like have this point of view of like doing something is risky, and it's like, yeah, but doing nothing can be very risky too, and you're kind of like discounting it.
That's actually a good point. It's a good sort of cognitive bias that we often have.
So my question is more of on AI governance. So there's a lot of frameworks and legislation going on. There's trustworthy AI in Europe and the AI Bill of Rights in the US. So how does Meta and other AI companies work along with these legislations? Because of course they're not enough to cover the expanse of AI. So how do you ensure that the power of AI that is being made, that is being invented, is being harnessed with these frameworks? Because these frameworks are simply not enough.
I think we all like care deeply about doing the right thing, right? So like I think like there's a huge amount of like self-regulation in the systems because like like people don't have to do this, right? I mean like most researchers can do like any number of things in any number of companies. They chose to like be at Meta or OpenAI or what have you because they truly believe in the mission and they want to do the right thing for the world. So I think like that by itself is just like a pretty good grounding. Besides that, I think like we have people that like either our researchers or people that are more on the policy teams that work alongside with regulators and policymakers to try to like shape what those regulations are in a way that is aligned with what I mean. Alignment is a big topic in AI, like the RoboCop, Skynet, pick your own sci-fi. Like you want those machines as they get smarter and smarter and more powerful. You want to make sure that they are aligned with what humans want them to do, and you want to make sure that the policies are designed to like force the systems to behave in those ways. And then after that, it's just, we comply. Like, we may not like the regulations in some cases, but, like you can either comply by not launching. It's like literally impossible for you to launch the product that you wanted. And so you just can't launch it. Or you're going to launch a version of the product that may not be as powerful as the one that you wished you could launch or as powerful as what you might have launched in other countries. But that's what, the local regulations, dictate that you need to do. And so you don't have a choice.
Yeah. And I think that people underestimate the extent to which there is sort of a culture of thinking about self-regulation among the platforms. Like the popular press has this sort of narrative of, we need to regulate. But sometimes it's just, it's disconnected from reality in terms of enforcement capability, right? I've always thought about this in the context of censorship, for example, right? If YouTube's algorithms are censoring, there's no alternative, there's no government-led alternative to that, right? I mean, this is something that you just have to cede to the platform, and the platform has sort of embraced it and is sort of very aggressively, sort of doing it. And there's, there are so many things I've seen through Facebook's history of trying to figure out, like, how do we govern the space that is Facebook? How do we set up a way in which this is a good, which were completely, this is at points where governments aren't even starting to think about, sort of those questions at all. And so, while of course it's not perfect, and while a private company optimizes for its own incentives, I think a lot of people underestimate the extent to which the large tech companies are really thinking about regulation in the broader sense. And we have a question up there.
I run several businesses, and I wanted your perspective on AI agents for businesses. How far are we from having agents and being able to take out headcounts and costs into our businesses? It feels like a big promise, but it feels incredibly difficult when you run businesses to get to that place.
Yeah, I mean, I think like there's a number of companies historically that have worked on things like RPA, robotic program, whatever it stands for. I don't even remember.
Robot process automation.
Process automation, right? So like companies like, Automation Anywhere, UiPath, and what have you. And historically, they were like low code, no code type of products where you had to have some amount of specialized knowledge, but not as hard as really writing like hard code to, assemble a workflow of different things. Just last week, Google announced, as part of their Cloud Next conference, they announced something called Workspace Flows, something like that. Don't quote me on the exact name, but it's basically like a way with completely no code, with somebody with, not a ton of like specialized knowledge to be able to connect, like a spreadsheet to like an email campaign to, something else or what have you. And I think you're going to continue to see more of these things, and they're going to be promptable by, like a chatbot like Gemini and others. There's a bunch of companies that try to do this in the enterprise space. And frankly, for the most part, the one of the challenging things is the data of the enterprise belongs to the enterprise. So it's not like big Fortune 500 companies going to take their internal screenshots of what their employees are looking at every day and putting them into Llama's model that is shared with their competitors. And so you do end up creating a bunch of silos of data, and each of them is pretty small. And that, unfortunately, the state of these models today is they need a lot of data to learn to be really good, and no company has necessarily enough data to be really good at this stuff. And I think that's where these agentic AI products tend to struggle, is they don't have enough data yet to be really good at. But in theory, you start to see those tool use, web navigation, generic agents that are available in the mainstream models that then get fine-tuned for very specific industry use cases.
Yeah, I often wonder about the cost structure there, whether do we have we can probably I'm running over in case there are more questions, or we can just if you have a question, raise your hand. Otherwise, yes.
I think when you think about the benefit of AI, a big thing is productivity. And I think in personal life, there's only much productivity to gain. I think most of the benefit will come to enterprise. And when I think about today's leading LLM providers, I think most of them do have enterprise DNA in them, like Microsoft, Google have Google Cloud, and OpenAI. They have enterprise version. But I think for Meta, traditionally is a B2C company. And I wonder if you guys have this mentality shift for basically pivot more towards enterprise customers when it comes to AI. And also, is that a challenge or an internal culture that needs to also be shifted accordingly?
Yeah. So first of all, HBR just published yesterday, or earlier this week, the renewed study of how people actually use those AI systems in general. And most of the use cases are actually personal. And in fact, they're very personal.
Yeah, therapy
the number one is therapy.
One,
yeah, the number one is companionship. Some of it is there's one of the quotes is somebody in South Africa that says, in my country, there's one therapist for 100,000 people or something like that. And so literally it's almost existential. In some countries, people desperately need help, and those AIs are probably the next, it's not as good as a real therapist, but it's probably much better than whatever they had before. So that's the consumer use case, and it's very meaningful, for billions of people. I don't remember what we ended up announcing, but there are hundreds of millions of people using Meta AI, which is the consumer version of Llama that's embedded inside of Meta's apps. Now, Llama itself is more of a B2B type of play, because the customer is a developer, and that could be a small independent developer coming up with their own idea and their own startup, or it could be a big enterprise customer using it inside of their their enterprise. But Meta is a B2B company, by the way. Our business is to sell ads, right? So our customers are advertisers. Our user, obviously everybody is a customer. Users are customers, but the actual flow of money comes from advertisers paying Meta to print ads. So we've always had a pretty large sales team and relationships with small and large companies, both directly and through channel partners. And the same type of stuff applies to Reality Labs, where we have a enterprise version of our consumer, reality, virtual reality, mixed reality headset type of programs that are also used by companies. So I think you'll see more of that in the Llama. But I wouldn't discount the consumer aspect. I think we, in our daily lives, a lot of us find really meaningful use cases for personal growth. And to your point, it's not all about productivity. A lot of it is just, entertainment and creativity and happiness and all sorts of other things that really matter to us as individuals.
Yeah, and hopefully that'll be the story of AI in the future, right? That it makes the world a better place and makes us all happier, not just richer. But
that is why we work really hard to build, build a better world.
This has been such a information-packed session. Thank you so much, Stephane.
Yeah, thanks for having me.